Let's continue our discussion of volcanoes and volcanic activity. We're back to the island of Anatan in the western Pacific. And if you look carefully at this picture, you'll notice that the slopes of the volcano are heavily eroded. This is that part of the tropics that is characterized by seasonal rainfall. Much of the tropics have two seasons. They have a wet season and a dry season, and this is one of those parts of the tropics that has a very distinct wet season. And during the heavy rains, the almost daily rains of the wet season, the clay soils that are derived from volcanic activity do erode quite heavily. The soils are characteristically red, and because of their high clay content, they tend to be rather sticky, kind of like the sticky clay that you use in, let's say, art class. Notice also that there's a cloud hanging over the highest part of the island. These islands are high enough that they start getting into a separate kind of an environment that we'll actually be talking more about much later on in this series. This environment is called cloud forest. This island and the others in this chain are rather heavily forested. But as you get to the highest elevations, the forest tends to change because the environment is frequently foggy, often cool, and even wetter than in the lowlands. So consequently, you have the development of communities with distinctive kinds of plant species and very extensive growth of moss and lichens and things like that. We'll actually take a look at some of these areas, as I said, later on. Now let's move to the active volcano on Anatan itself. Notice the steep slopes of this crater. And notice also that the area is forested pretty much to the summit of the crater, and even down into the depths of the crater you can see things that look like trees and shrubs. And indeed that's what they are. Also notice that yellow looking body of water down there. That is a lake that is heated from volcanic activity, and the waters are rich in things like sulfur and that sort of thing, and so it gives it this odd kind of an appearance. If you look carefully on the rim of the volcano, you'll also notice these little things that look like palm trees. And actually they're not palm trees. They are plants that are much more primitive than that. We're looking down upon tree ferns, which are one of the kinds of plants left over from before the time of the dinosaurs. And in fact, there's another group of palm-like plants growing in this area too, referred to as tree cycads. And here's a close-up of one. They superficially are like palm trees, but notice that this tree has a cone in the center of it. That means that it dates from a time before there were flowering plants. So Carboniferous kinds of times, these would have been the plants that one might have found in the forests if one could go back in time to them. And to this day, species like this one still persist in tropical parts of the world. Now let's take a look at this same area several years later, after the eruption. Notice that all the plants are gone. Notice also that the lake is gone. The intensity of the blast of this eruption was so great that it virtually sterilized this area. And so now, in the intervening years since it's erupted, we can expect that plants will again start to recolonize. But as you can see from this current photo, Not much of that has occurred yet. Notice also that there is a plume of gas coming out of the volcano. This is a mixture of water vapor and methane and a number of other kinds of toxic gases that are typical of these kinds of volcanoes. This place is part of that portion of the world referred to as the Ring of Fire, which extends from Japan down through the Mariana Islands and across to the Indonesian islands. One of the places in the Indonesian islands you've probably heard of is Krakatoa. And within this ring of fire, the volcanoes do tend to be explosive. So, for example, Krakatoa just disappeared from the face of the earth. Actually, it's now starting to rebuild. The island has again resurfaced, and it's been over 100 years since that eruption, so it's again being colonized by plants and animals. And the same thing will happen here. Now, the kinds of phenomena that result from tectonic activity, things like volcanic eruptions and earthquakes, these also produce waves. We've talked a little bit about tsunamis, tidal waves, but let's turn our attention to the related phenomena of seismic waves. These come in two forms. They come in the form of longitudinal waves, P waves, and if you recall from general science or freshman physics or one of those courses you might have had, a longitudinal wave is one in which a particle moves back and forth in the same direction that the wave moves. Now, P waves are fast-moving waves, and they can move through any kind of matter, solid, liquid, gas. On the other hand, S waves are transverse waves, where a particle moves perpendicular to the direction of wave motion. So if you think of shaking a jump rope or something like that, you have an idea of what a transverse wave might look like. Now, these do not travel through liquids, and they tend to have a lower velocity. Let's continue on our discussion of volcanoes. This is the island of Sarigan, which is Anatahan's nearest neighbor. And although Anatahan is an active volcano, and the island to the north of Sarigan, the island of Pagan, is also an active volcano, Sarigan is not. It's an extinct volcano. It has all those characteristic features of volcanic islands, the steep slopes and the black sand beaches and all that sort of thing. But it is no longer active and has not been active in a very long time. Let's go to its summit and take a look. Now here we are at the summit of Sarigan, this plateau that forms the upper part of the island, and we're looking in the background towards this one higher spot. This thing is called a volcanic plug, and that is what is left of the last time this island erupted. That material that was in the throat of the volcano cooled and solidified into rather hard rock. The surrounding volcanic rim is largely eroded away, and so it's left this in its place. Now, this spot that we're looking at here is probably one of the most magical places I've ever been. This is an uninhabited island, as are most of the Mariana Islands. And I was actually there not studying geology, but studying birds. And this was one of my survey points. I was looking at the birds that live in the forests there. And there were little copses of forest, little patches of forest, in other words, on this plateau area. And we're looking at an erythrina tree. And the erythrina, the lowest branch of it, on that branch there was sitting, just about the time I took this picture, I didn't get him in the picture, but he had been there within the last few minutes, was a red-footed falcon, a bird that had never been seen before in this part of the world. And it's quite a remarkable thing to see, because they really do have blood red, fire engine red feet. And he was sitting just a few feet away from me, looking at me. Probably had gotten lost on his way south, migrating somewhere in China or someplace like that, and had gotten blown out to sea and wound up on the island of Sarigan. Notice also that a lot of the background is grassy. Although these are wet islands, the volcanic soil will sometimes grow grass instead of trees. It's a particular kind of a grass called swordgrass, and just like its name suggests, it's pretty god-awful stuff to try to walk through. It is very sharp, and if you try to walk through it with shorts on, you're going to get your legs lacerated. In order to do field work in these kinds of environments, you really have to be prepared for it. You've got to wear long pants. I would usually tuck my pants into my socks. It's a very different experience from walking in the woods here in the temperate zone of North America. So let's review. Volcanoes tend to develop near the boundaries between tectonic plates, where magma from deep in the earth can break through to the surface. They're particularly frequent along the boundaries of continental and oceanic plates, although they can certainly be found also at the boundary between ocean plates. The volcanoes we're looking at here are of that latter category. They can also develop over hotspots, and that's what we see in the Hawaiian Islands, and we'll be looking at one of those shortly. Those places that act like convection cells in a boiling kettle of water. Those areas can also weaken the Earth's crust and permit magma to break through to the surface. And one of the interesting things that we see in the Hawaiian Islands is that as the hotspot has moved, new Hawaiian Islands have been created. Now, when magma does break through to the surface, it can flow as lava. Although these kinds of islands in the Marianas are more typically associated with ash and gas expulsion. I've actually been through a couple eruptions, and everything was covered in volcanic ash, this gray, gritty kind of stuff that just covered every surface. So let's have one final view of the island of Sarigan, looking towards the island of Anatahan. Notice that characteristic volcano kind of shape of Anatahan. Notice also in the foreground that it looks almost like Sarigan has a lawn, like somebody goes out and mows that. Well, in fact, it is grass, and it is mowed, but not by people. It is kept that way by goats. Goats were brought to this island and others in this chain by the early Spanish explorers in the 1600s and even the 1500s. The sailors put goats and pigs on these islands so that when they came back they'd have a source of fresh meat, and the descendants of those goats and pigs still live on Sarigan and other islands in these chains to this day. In fact, one of the things that I was doing when I was out there was trying to control these feral animals, because they have a catastrophic effect on these island ecosystems. Native plants and native animals don't do well in the presence of these feral creatures. So here we are at the Kilauea volcano in the Hawaiian Islands. This one is on the big island of Hawaii, and it is where the hot spot presently resides, although over time it will be moving away from this area, and the island of Hawaii, which is presently the biggest of the Hawaiian Islands, will start to erode and become smaller. Now notice that this is a very different kind of a crater than the Anatahan crater. It is very active, but it is of a very different type of volcanic activity than we saw in Anatahan. So let's consider what types of volcanoes can develop. There are three types. There are cinder cones, which are relatively broad and gently sloping kinds of volcanoes built from cinders that are ejected from the throat of the volcano, also known as its vent. Composite volcanoes tend to be the very steep-sided ones that are built not only from ash but also from lava flows. And then there are the shield volcanoes, built almost entirely from fluid lava, the kind that you see in the Hawaiian Islands that don't undergo these explosive eruptions that eject rocks and things like that. They are relatively quiet kinds of eruptions. So let's look at pictures. So you're looking here at Mauna Kea, which is one of the two giant volcanoes that make up the big island of Hawaii. You can see that classic low sloping kind of a shape. It's a really big volcano, and when you're up at the top, there's snow up there. I'll show you a picture from the top in just a minute. But despite its immense size, it's very broad, and it is characterized by the kinds of eruptions that are not explosive. So here we are at the top. Notice that cone in the background? That is one of the characteristic features of these shield volcanoes, is that there are lots of vents. The whole landscape of the upper regions of Mauna Kea are just riddled with all these vents like this. Now we are so high up on the mountain at this point that even though we're in the tropics near the equator, it was cold up there the day that I was there. I was actually not studying volcanoes when I was there. I was studying the birds that live in this open kind of forest that is up at the highest elevations of Mauna Kea. They're called Mamani forests. It's a species of tree that's related to peas, pea plants. It's in that same family. And it produces these pods, and there's a particular kind of a bird, the palila, that eats these things, these seeds from these pods. And in modern times, this is the only place where that species found. Prehistorically, it seems that it had a wider range, but once introduced mosquitoes got to the Hawaiian Islands, along with the diseases that they carry, most of the native Hawaiian birds have become relegated to the high elevations where these tropical mosquitoes have not yet gotten to. Now here we are a little lower down the mountain in an area with a reasonably fresh lava flow in the foreground. These things are absolutely treacherous to walk on, by the way. You can break through these things and just disappear. So going into the field and the high elevations of the Hawaiian Islands is a rather treacherous kind of a pastime. Underneath these things you can have the development of lava tubes, which are basically holes in the ground where lava flowed when it was liquid and then they emptied out. And if you're walking in the wrong place, you can break into one of these things and that'll be the end of you. Notice in the background there's a little hummock of vegetation. The Hawaiians call these things kipukas, places where the lava flow did not kill off the surrounding forest. A little bit higher micro elevation, often around one of these cones, one of these vents, and so the forest on those survives. Notice also that the sky is very clear and blue in the last picture. On these upper elevations of the island, you are essentially above the rain line, and it gets rather dry. This area right here is kind of in between. You still have a fair amount of moisture, but in the previous picture it's actually quite dry up there. It's just barely moist enough to support that savanna-like kind of tree growth. But as you go further down the mountain, you are in rainforest. Take a look at this picture here, for example. You can see that it's a very different kind of a view. Once you descend below a certain altitude, the altitude at which the clouds accumulate at, it rains a whole lot, and it's a very different kind of an environment. Here we are still further down the mountain in the rainforest. You can see how gray and misty it is. These are the Koa Ohia rainforests of the mid-elevations on Mauna Kea. Koa and Ohia are two native endemic species that are the two most abundant trees within this forest. Both evolved on the Hawaiian Islands in isolation, so they are endemic species. Let's take a look at one last volcano before we leave this topic. This is Mount Batur on the island of Bali in Indonesia. Very much in that part of the world that's referred to as the Ring of Fire. Some of the most dangerous volcanoes in the world are indeed in this region. On the island of Bali, you are not far from where Krakatoa is, that volcano that vaporized in the 19th century, changing the world's climate for over a year. Now, Mount Batur is out of that same kind of type. It is one of these volcanoes that can have explosive eruptions, although it also does produce lava and ash and all that sort of thing. It produces gas. It, in its profile, looks rather like a composite cone, in fact. And if you look carefully at this picture, you might be able to see some blacker areas, which are recent lava flows. Now, this volcano actually sits within the crater of a much older, bigger volcano. You can see some of the crater in the foreground. It is the son of that more ancient volcano, and it has a rather bad reputation. Some years before I took this photograph, the volcano had a major release of gas, which filtered down into that valley where people live. There are towns and villages and all that sort of thing down there. And during the night, when this toxic gas enveloped some of these villages, everyone in the village was killed. So these are pretty scary places. You can hike up this. There actually is a hiking trail that goes up this, but it's a bit of a risky pastime. You never really know what these kinds of volcanoes are going to do. The whole time we were there, in the vicinity of Mount Batur, it continued to emit gas and steam and that sort of thing. It's kind of an ominous landscape. It's a very beautiful landscape, but oh boy, it can be a dangerous place if you're there on the wrong day. With that, we're going to leave the tropical Pacific rather unwillingly for me, but we're going to be moving on to other topics in our next video. My parting shot here is of one of the rock islands in the Palau Island chain in the far western Pacific, between the Mariana Islands and the Philippines. These rock islands are not volcanic in origin, but are limestone islands. They are the result of coral activity and changes in sea level. As sea level fell, these islands were exposed, but you can still see on the rocks in these islands the fossilized remains of the corals that made them. And the corals themselves are still very much alive in the waters beneath these islands. This is a very popular diving destination, this giant lagoon that a good 1,000 or more rock islands exist in is a place of very vibrant coral reefs with immense diversity of corals and fishes and all sorts of marine organisms. So it's a very popular place with snorkelers and divers. The sunset that you see here, by the way, is fairly typical. This part of the world, there are phenomenal sunsets more often than not. It is a consequence of the nature of the atmosphere and light in this part of the planet. Let me give you a little preview of what's coming next time. We're going to be moving from the tropical Pacific to the southern Appalachians. This is a view of the Great Smoky Mountains in the North Carolina-Tennessee area. Notice that it is green down in the valley, but there doesn't appear to be too much going on at the upper elevations. This is a demonstration of the advance of seasons, and it occurs not only according to the calendar, but it also occurs with respect to elevation. And so it is springtime down in the valley of these fairly considerable mountains. Keep in mind that the Appalachians are very ancient mountains. They are mountains that come to us from dinosaur times. And so they're heavily eroded. And you can see how rounded they are in this image here. But still, some of these southern Appalachian peaks are still rather substantial. And so as you travel up those peaks, it gets colder and colder and colder till you're up at the top, and even though you're in North Carolina, it's more like you're in Vermont. So we will learn more about that next time. We'll see this image again and we'll discuss it in greater detail.